What's up, everyone? My name is Pastor Andy, and I'm here at Viral Conference 2018. The theme for this year is Rabbits and Rhinos. It's about rethinking church planting in Africa and the rest of the world in this century. Now, we've had some phenomenal plenary speakers coming through from all over the place, and you're about to listen and hear from one of them. So sit back and enjoy this as God shapes and changes and shifts our mindsets regarding extending His kingdom here on earth. It's Viral 2018. God bless.
Now, I'm coming to speak to you after a Scotsman has been up here talking to us about the Trinity. And thank you, Gilbert. I sat there and I thought, la. And I'm going to talk about some of the same sorts of things that he talked about, but from such a different angle. And so lend me your ears and listen keenly. I want to tell you a story. So in some senses, my session is easy. I want to tell you a story. I've been trying to read books on movements, great movements of God in the history of the church, because I want to learn, how do movements happen? How do they begin? What triggers them off? How do they progress? Where do they peak? What happens after the peak? And many movements have happened in the history of the church. Maybe the first movement of God in a powerful way in the redemption of mankind was the movement that we read about in the book of Acts. That after the persecution in Jerusalem, the church spread and the gospel spread. The second movement in history is probably the conversion of the Roman Empire. And we were told by Pastor Moses that it wasn't that Constantine converted necessarily. There was a political element to the conversion of Rome. But if you read a historian called Rodney Stark, who writes to answer the question, why did the world convert to Christianity in Constantine's days? One of the things that helped the conversion of the church, or rather caused the conversion, was the spread of the Black Plague, bubonic plague, across the known world. Hundreds of thousands of people in Rome and in other cities died as a result of this plague that was being spread by rats. People abandoned cities. They left, they ran away. It was like Ebola. People ran away. They left their loved ones. But the Christians stayed and cared for the dying. And two things happened as a result of that. Number one is that those who had run away, when they came back after the plague had burned itself out, they could not believe that their mother, that their daughter had survived the plague, and it was the Christians who cared for them. And the conversion rate just rose as a result of this show of love. But as the Christians stayed in these cities, they began to develop an immunity to the plague. And more of them survived to care for more and more people who otherwise would have died. And after the bubonic plague, many hundreds of thousands of people converted to Christianity. And Constantine could not but recognize the fact. And as a politician, he decided that his nation would become Christian. A third movement in the history of the church would be St. Patrick of Ireland and the Celtic movement. A fourth one would be William Carey and the evangelistic parachurch mission movement that he gave rise to. A fifth one would be John Wesley and Francis Asbury. John Wesley in Europe, in the UK, Francis Asbury, an Englishman who moved over to the US. And together they led what became the Methodist Church in the mid-18th century. A sixth one would be the rise of the Baptist Church in the same 18th century. And then the student volunteer missionary movement that began in the early 20th century. The Azusa Pacific movement and the rise of the Pentecostal church at the beginning of the last century. The movement and growth of Christianity in Africa in the 20th century. The growth of Christianity in China after the missionaries were kicked out. And when China reopened again to the amazement of the whole church, it was said that there was somewhere between 50 to 80 million Chinese Christians. And then there's the ongoing movement in the southern hemisphere today, especially in places like Ethiopia and Algeria and Korea and in India. God is a movement maker. I believe that no man can engineer a movement. Only God can. But God uses men and women like you and I. And I'm praying for a church planting movement. And I'm praying that God would make it happen in Africa and around the world in my lifetime. And I'm praying that God would let me live to see it. And I'm praying that I will be ready and I will recognize when it begins to happen. Maybe like Simeon in the temple praying that he would see the Messiah. A movement is like a sea wave. You can't manufacture a sea wave. And if you're a surfer, you don't manufacture the sea waves that you surf on. What you do is you wait for them. You're in the right place at the right time. And as the wave begins, you get up on your surfboard and you ride the wave. You don't manufacture the wave, but you are there and you're ready and you're waiting and you ride the wave. And so I've been reading on all these movements, finding books that can inform me on what movements are and how they happen, how they're triggered, what is the life of a movement. And one of the movements that I've been reading recently that has really rocked me and shaken me to the core is a thick book that records the beginnings of the astronomical growth of the Methodist Church in the United States of America in the mid-18th century. Why did the Methodist Church grow so quickly? When at the same time they started, they were the laughing stock of the established churches in America when the American frontier was being populated. The Anglican Church was the largest church in the U.S. at that time, largely located in the growing cities. Of course, the UK to a large measure had been colonized by people moving from Europe, and the Anglican Church established itself. It was the big boy on the block. And they would look at the Methodist church, small, teeny-weeny little church, many little ministers, and they would laugh at them. They were led by an educated clergy, the Anglican Church was. They had good buildings, a lot of wealth. They were being subsidized even from Europe. The Presbyterians were not far behind them. They too were a big, strong, established church. Nobody took the Methodists seriously. They laughed at them because their pastors were uneducated and unrefined. They laughed because they considered the Methodist pastors to be simple folk who didn't even speak good English. Many of the Methodist leaders had only a smattering of education. They could speak and not very good English. They had never been to school. The Methodist preachers were very charismatic, even wild. In their meetings, people would be falling down. What we would call today slain by the Spirit. They would speak with such fervor that their mouths would begin to froth, and they would talk about the damnation of hell. And if you did not believe in Christ, you are going to hell. And people would be there frightened by these Methodist preachers. They did not speak in churches because they had few, if any, churches. Their services were often unstructured and wild. They preached in barns and bars and any room that they could find, not in respectable churches. And they were not wealthy, they were not landed, they did not have status in society. They were the riffraff of the society that was developing in the US. And many of the people who came to their meetings were just simple common folk, artisans, shoemakers, carpenters, and farmers. The Anglicans called the Methodist pastors exceedingly low and ignorant. But while the Anglicans laughed at them, the Methodists began to grow. And to the astonishment of everyone, within less than 30 years, they soon overtook the numbers of Catholics, the Presbyterians, the Baptists, and the Anglicans. And when they started, there was 0.something% of the population of churchgoers in America. But within 30 to 50 years, they were 35% of all churchgoers in America were attending these Methodist church. In 1770, there were only 1,000 Methodists. 10 years later, they had grown to 8,000. 1 out of every 800 church attenders was a Methodist. In 1790, they had grown to 58,000 Methodists. In 1800, 10 years later, they had grown to 64,000. 1810, they had grown to 170,000 Methodists. By 1820, their numbers were now 250,000. By 1830, they were 500,000. By 1850, they were 1 million. And by 1870, there were 3 million Methodists in the US. 1 out of every 3 people who went to church on a regular basis was a Methodist. They had 29,000 itinerant evangelists, 24,000 pastors, and their congregations had grown from the initial 65 congregations to over 13,000 congregations. So why did they grow so rapidly? What was it about the Methodists that made them grow by leaps and bounds? All this time, the Anglicans were calling them untutored, uneducated, simple folk, riffraff. But the Anglicans were not growing. And the Presbyterians were not growing. In fact, they were declining. But the Methodists, even as they were being laughed at, were growing. There are a couple of reasons that historians say the Methodists grew because. And the first one was because of their social location. I want to put a triangle on the screen here and explain it to you so that you understand what social location is. This was America in the 1700s, and it is much of Africa today. We are what are called pyramidical societies. A pyramidical society means that there are a few at the top of the pyramid who are wealthy, and there are massive numbers of people at the bottom of the pyramid who are poor. So let me show you how it works in Kenya, okay? The 1% in Kenya, the next slide, the 1% in Kenya, the rich, the uber rich, the wealthy of this nation earn somewhere between $5,000 and above per month. If you earn 500,000 Kenyan shillings a month, between you and your wife, you are considered to be the uber rich of this country. Anything above $5,000 or 500,000 Kenyan shillings. You can convert that into Ugandan shillings and to the other, denominations from your country. But 5,000 in Kenya, only 1%, about 500,000 people in Kenya earn that sort of money and above. They are the uber rich. And this isn't just your salary. It's you and your husband or you and your wife per household combined. So you may be earning 300,000 and your spouse is earning 200,000. You are part of the 1% in this country. The next category of people are the middle class. The next slide are the middle class. The middle class earns somewhere between $500,000 between $500 to $5,000. In other words, anything between how much is it? 50,000 to 500,000. You are considered the middle class in this country. Only 6% of this country earns in that bracket. The middle class. Only 6%. And these are statistics from 2014. So they're 4 years old and maybe it's budged a little. But only 7% of Kenya earns more than 50,000 shillings a month. And you thought you were poor. The third category, by world standards, they too are called the middle class. They earn somewhere between $50 and $500 per month per household. Anything between 5,000 Kenyan shillings to 50,000 Kenyan shillings is considered also to be middle class. But in Kenya, you and I know that 5,000 shillings you cannot survive. Especially when it's you and your husband or you and your wife who are earning this. And 50,000 to bring up a family and do everything that you need, very few earn in that bracket. The government calls them middle class. And the reason why they're also called middle class is because by world standards, the poor are those who earn less than $1 a day or less than $1.5 a day. $1.5 a day is equals to $45 per month, which is 4,500 shillings per month between you and your husband or you and your wife, and those are called the poor. So if you earn more than 45,000 between the two of you, then statistically you are counted to be middle class. But you and I know you cannot survive on that and bring up children and pay rent and etc. So I call them the working poor. 43% of Kenya earns between $50 to $500 a month. And then the poor, less than $1 a month or $1.5, in other words, less than $50 per month, 40% of Kenya earns in that bracket. These are the poor, even by international standards. And at the bottom of the pile are the destitute poor, the elderly in the rural areas who are starving to death, the street people who have no income at all, and they make up 10% of the population. And so if you look at Kenya, I would say, counting the working poor, and the destitute, 93% of this nation lives at a cost that makes life unbearable. And the rich and the middle class only make up 7% of our nation. We are a pyramid, very few at the top, very many at the bottom. This was America in the 1700s, and this is much of Africa today. Now, here's the truth. You see that little red dot? Many of us want our churches to be at the top, among the middle class and among the wealthy. But here's the truth, good people. You do not make movements in the 7%. The pool is too small. If you want to reach Kenya for Christ, if you want to reach Africa for Christ, you make movements in the 93%. The next slide. That's where movements happen. That is where the equivalent of Kenya's 47 million people, 40 million people, 44 million people live where that red dot is. And movements happen among the 44 million people, not among the 3 million at the top. If you want to reach this country for Kenya, You need to be working among the poor and the working poor and the destitute poor. Even though we all want our churches in the middle class and among the rich, movements don't happen at the top. They happen where the people are. And the Methodist Church in the 1700s was socially located among the poor and the working folk. The Anglican Church was at the top, in whatever percentage was the wealthy and the middle class. So they were not growing. But the Methodist Church was socially located at a place where it would grow. Secondly, they spoke the language of the people. They could speak the lingo, the street talk of the people. The American Revolution was quickly changing the US when they were unshackling themselves from their colonial masters, whether it was the French or the English. And Americans had a new way that they wanted to construct their society. People spoke of freedom and equality. They did not want the old, English privileged society and the patronage that was given to the landed gentry who were wealthy and rich, and everybody else served them. Americans did not want this. They came to the new lands so that they could make a life for themselves, and they did not want the old colonial structures. And so in the American Revolution, they unshackled themselves. The Anglicans, who were among the privileged, did not know how to speak to all these people talking about freedom. But the Methodists and their leaders came from the people who wanted freedom. And so when they spoke, everybody knew what they were talking about. They were speaking the language of the people, where the majority of people were. Thirdly, while the Anglicans preached about doctrinal, theological, analytical, logical issues, and while the Anglicans preached to educate their congregations, the Methodists preached about getting saved. They appealed to the experiential, spiritual thirst of the common person. They preached about hell and eternal damnation. They preached about real, down-to-earth, practical issues. The Anglicans preached to the mind. The Methodists preached to the heart. The Methodists would go from house to house, from town to town, round and round again and again in what they called their circuits, going from one town to the next, and then they'd go around again and again and again. And it would take them 3 or 4 months to make a circuit. And they went round and round. They would come to a homestead. They would call people out. They would preach hell and salvation to them. People would get saved, and then they would go on to the next place. They would meet in bars, anywhere where people could gather. The Anglicans were in the town, sitting on comfortable sofas, smoking cigars and maybe drinking a little port. And they were debating theological issues, but they never went out. And so the Methodists were converting people, but the Anglicans were not, for they never went out into the rural areas. For the Methodists, salvation was their main message. And when people got saved, they would organize them into small Bible study groups called class meetings that were like the missional meetings that Pastor Moses told us about. And they would disciple them intentionally, deeply in those class meetings. Number 5, initially the Methodists had very few clergy. So a preacher would have 20 to 30 churches to take care of. So they would visit these churches, and on Monday they would go here, Tuesday there, Wednesday there, preaching, teaching the saints, calling them to holiness, and they would go around, and it would take them anything between 3 to 4 months to do a full circuit to all their churches. So Sunday by Sunday, the churches did not have a pastor. There were no resident pastors. There were too few pastors. And so the lay people rose up. And because this pastor came once every 3 or 4 months, in the time in between, It was a common man in the church who preached the message, who ordered the service. And the ministry of the Word of God and the care of the church and the expansion of the church was in the hands of the common people, not in the hands of clergy. As the church grew, they developed a low-control system of church management because the pastor was never there. He was doing his circuit since they couldn't control it from a central office. And so the leaders allowed and encouraged people to use their imagination to evangelize and to teach the Word of God. When you got saved, one of the things they did is they allowed you to go and share your story. And so people would go in their local community and they would be sharing how they came to know Christ and what God had done for them. And as they learned to do this, they would begin to learn to preach. And many of the early preachers, having not been taught, would listen to the pastor when he came around once every 3 months. And they would preach exactly the same message like the pastor had preached. They only had one message. So today I preached here, tomorrow I went there, the next day I went there, the next Sunday I was there, and it was the same message. And because I couldn't change my message, I was not tutored, I changed my congregation and preached the same message. And next time he came around, I would listen carefully and I would copy. And I would tell my stories, but the message was the same. It was the lay people who were doing the work. Number 6, they had only 2 types of church leaders. The first was an itinerant evangelist, the circuit riders, who went around preaching the gospel. And then there was a pastor. The circuit rider went from town to town, day by day, preaching away from home for 3 or 4 months. So many of the circuit riders made the decision that they would never get married. Because you couldn't look after a family when you are on the road for 3-4 months away from home. And it was understood that the call into ministry was a call into celibacy. And you did not get married. Sometimes, after a long time of doing this, they would get married. And when they did, many of them would then settle down and become a pastor in one location and in one community. These itinerant evangelists were largely uneducated, but they were encouraged to learn the scriptures. And what they were taught by Francis Asbury is, as you rode on a horse from this town to the next town, you use that time sitting in the saddle to study the scriptures. And they would be reading their Bible as their horse went along to the next place. And they had a theology that arose out of the saddle. They did not go to Bible school, for there were no Bible schools among the Methodists in the early days. They were not tutored, for there were no professors to teach them. And their passion was to be on the road. So they read their Bibles and they read anything they could get their hands onto. They read the little circulars that the Methodist Church made as it tried to instruct them. And they grew out of their personal knowledge of Christ and their personal knowledge of the scriptures. Later on, they changed the model a little. And they would give a circuit rider a mentor who he could ride with. As I did my circuit, then I would take a young man with me and I would be teaching him as we went along until he was ready now to begin his own circuit. Many of those young circuit riders were 17, 18-year-olds. They were the evangelists of the church. The pastors were older, for they got married on later on in life and settled down. But the circuit riders were very young. Another reason why they grew is that the Methodists had no buildings or churches. They met where they could, in homes, in bars, in barns, or wherever they could find a place to meet. And because their pastors were not paid, They were supposed to be paid, but there was no money. And the people they were preaching to were poor. Because they were not paid, money did not hinder them from preaching or meeting or spreading the gospel. The most they hoped for is that as I came to visit you, you could give me a meal and a place to sleep before I went on the next day. But their churches were therefore unencumbered with building projects and bills and salaries and financial need. And so the gospel could grow. Another reason why they grew so rapidly is because women and slaves, particularly African American slaves, were welcomed in their church. Those in the margin of society were welcomed. And many actually became preachers and leaders and evangelists, especially among the slaves and African Americans. So the church quickly grew. When the call came to free slaves, the Methodists preached freedom and took the position that slavery was wrong, and they called for the freedom of the slaves. It almost split the church, because the churches in the South where slavery was practiced disagreed with the churches in the North, but the churches in the North prevailed, and the Methodist Church called for the freedom of slaves. What grew the Methodist Church? They reached the common people, not the elite. They didn't care that people laughed at them. They just got on with the work of preaching the gospel. Their main message was focused on evangelism and salvation, and the gospel was at the center. Number 4, they immediately discipled their converts in class meetings and in the many discipleship camps that they held. Number 5, they freed their people to do ministry. Ministry belonged to the laity, not to the clergy. They did not depend on clergy, but on untrained lay people to spread the gospel. Number 6, they had simple oversight structures, but they freed the churches to organize themselves. 7, they immediately raised up leaders by giving people the freedom to minister. And they chose the best they had, and these were apprenticed by those who had been there longer, and they started their own circuit and preached the gospel. They had no theological schools. These leaders, number 8, were willing to suffer for the gospel. Number 9, they had no buildings to build and maintain. They had little need for money. Number 10, they had room for marginalized people like slaves and women. But 100 years after growing phenomenally, the Methodist Church peaked and it began to decline. After 100 years of this movement, it stopped growing. Today, the Methodist Church is not really seen as a leading gospel church in the United States. It's largely known for its social concerns and engagement in issues of justice, but not for the gospel. Today, it is seen as a mainline church that is old and tired, no energy, no fervor, no gospel. It was the rabbit that grew into a rhino. Right now, it's struggling with division. It's expected to split over the gay rights issue. I believe it was just about a month ago that they made a decision to embrace same-sex marriage. And yet 200 years ago, this church was taking heaven by storm as the fastest growing gospel church in the United States of America. They were a movement. So you have to ask a question, what killed the church? There are 7 things that seem to have contributed. I'll give you 5 that seem to have contributed to killing the movement. The first was that in 1850, after 70 years of ministry, because the laughter of the Anglicans and Presbyterians had finally become too much, in 1850, they decided to train and qualify their pastors to get them a theological education. So in a gap of 15 or so years, They massively started up theological colleges and started, took their best pastors and taught them theology, taught them how to preach properly, taught them how to speak, in a way that was not as wild as it had been before, and it killed the church. The theologically trained pastors were professionals who could no longer speak the language of the common man. They began to preach to the head, talking about the Greek and the Hebrew and, phrasing the terms and talking about, things that the common person on the street could not understand. They lost their fervor. They lost that wild look in their eyes as they talked about the kingdom of heaven. They were intellectuals, which is what the Methodist Church now wanted to be. They were good at speaking about theological debates, but they could no longer speak to the street man. Secondly, the church became wealthy. Their numbers grew. Their members, who were artisans, carpenters, and such, began to build wealth in this new America. Their members by now had begun to rise up because of their hard work, making money. The members were also becoming increasingly powerful in society. They now joined civil movements. They became a part of, the city council. They went into politics. Their members were becoming increasingly powerful because they were wealthy. They entered politics, social gathering, and the wealth killed the movement because it now became important that the church look respectable and good and behave properly in society. They had an image to protect. Now, no more wild preaching. No more people falling down struck or slain by the Spirit. No more hell and brimstone in the pulpit. No more wild frothing at the mouth, talking about hell and eternal damnation. They killed the old passion so that they could look good and respectable. Thirdly, the new trained clergy also started taking control of the church. The church became more centralized, more bureaucratic, more clerical, and more respectable. Ministry was taken from the laity, and it became the work of the clergy. And now it was expected that their members would sit and listen and learn from learned clergy. And it was a clergy who went out to do ministry. Yours was to come to church on a weekly basis and to give a tithe. Lay people receded into the background as professional clergy took over. Fourthly, the church's public image became important. They became far less countercultural as they tried to fit into society. They started building massive, beautiful chapels and cathedrals. Respectable people don't meet in barns and bars. And they started looking more and more like the Anglicans and the Presbyterians because their social location was moving up from the common people into the middle class and into the wealthy. Movements don't happen at the top of the pyramid. And finally, evangelism stopped. More and more, the landscape of America changed. People now moved into towns, and they were no longer in the frontier settlements. The class meetings died because it was not respectable to go and be asked questions, as the Methodists would do, about your purity and about how you are living your life. People sought to protect their privacy. Unpolished, uneducated preaching died as members longed to be accepted by their more polished neighbors. And overall, the church found itself unable to adapt to the new America that lived in cities and towns. From around 1870, the movement started to die. Preachers called for reform, to go back to the old ways, but the church was unable to turn around. It couldn't adapt to the new America, and so the movement died. As I've read about the Methodist Church, this is what I've learned. And it frightens me because, guys, I'm leading a church that is largely in the 7%. And movements don't happen there. And I'm asking the Lord, how do we move from this 7% to the 93%, which is Kenya, to the poor and the needy, and make movements happen there? We've made a commitment that for every church that we plant that looks like the chapel, we will plant at least 2 or 3 that are in the slums and in the peri-urban areas and in the periphery of the city that do not look like Nairobi Chapel, that do not do what Nairobi Chapel does. We don't want them to have lights and good sound systems and whatever. We want them to be different, relevant to the people where they are, not copying us. And so I've come to believe that there are 7 things that we must do. The first is, movements happen because of the white-hot faith of disciples driven by a passion for evangelism and discipleship. Did you know that a new church reaches 8 times more people through conversion, 10 times more people through conversion than a church that has been in existence for 10 years or more? And the reason is because when you begin a new church, you are out trying to draw people to church, telling them about Jesus Christ. But once you have a congregation of 100, 200, you now change from evangelism to try and pastor and disciple the people you have. And it's so much work that evangelism diminishes and you stop growing. But movements happen because of white-hot faith for evangelism and discipleship, driven by disciples who have a passion for it. Because men and women of faith are willing to step out of their comfort zone and go, no matter what the cost is, even without pay. Movements do not happen in comfortable, well-padded, cozy armchairs in boardrooms. Secondly, movements happen where the masses are. If your goal is to reach the top 1% in your country or the top 6% middle class or whatever the percentage is, you will never see a movement. You will never win your country for Christ. We need as pastors to stop chasing wealth and money and buildings. The pastors who have great honor or should have great honor among us are the ones who have paid a price and abandoned those things and are in the difficult, hard areas and are reaching people massively. Thirdly, movements happen because ministry belongs to the lay people and they are free to minister at the center of the movement, heavily involved. Empower the lay people, disciple them, teach them the basics of the Christian faith, and then free them and get out of the way. Free them to do what God has raised them to do. The church does not belong to the clergy. Oftentimes, we are the problem, and we kill the movements of God that He's trying to initiate. Fourthly, movements are driven by young people. I like to say that movements happen between 17 years and 27 years. It's young people who go out and change the world. Old people sit in boardrooms and discuss the issues. They don't go. Now, from what our dear Scotsman taught us, Gilbert, the old people have their place. It's not either or, it's both and. The old people lay the foundation and give the permission. They release the young people. The old people set the context for movements. The old people have the gift of wisdom and experience, but the young people have the passion to run. It is the young people who become the fire of the movement, the troops of the movement. The young people need the old people, but without the young people, there is no movement. It's not either or, it's both and. Number 5, movements are like a forest fire, a Holy Ghost fire. They spread wild and fast, and the more you try to control them, the more you kill them. The more you try and tidy them up, the more you quench them. The more centralized and bureaucratic your controls are, the less the church grows. The more rules and bylaws you put in place, the more you kill the movement. The more you try and protect the culture of the church, the less likely that you will ever see a movement. And the more you try and brand and clone your church, every church must look the same, have the same colors, do the same thing, preach the same message, sing the same songs. The more you try and brand and have your name and you clone your church, the less likely you are ever to have a movement. Martin Luther of Germany, 500 years ago, from whom the Lutheran Church began, used to say this: God created out of nothing, and unless a man becomes nothing, God cannot use them to create. Too many of us are trying to raise a brand. We're trying to raise an empire. We're not building the kingdom of Jesus. We're building our own little empire with our name on it. And we talk about our empire around the world, or around Africa, or around the country. God is not in the business of building empires for little men and women like you and I. He's in the work of building a kingdom that has His name. Number 6, and this one is frightening. Wealth and money can kill a movement. It's like water poured on a fire. The pastors become fat and lazy, comfortable. They don't want to move out. They don't want to sacrifice for ministry. They want to be respectable and to reach the rich. The more respectable and wealthy a church becomes, the more it tends to protect its image and its reputation. The more it protects its image, the less likely it is to take risks. The less risks it takes, the slower it grows. Money and abundance can kill a movement, not fuel it. Let's be honest, guys. When we don't have money and there are bills, we are men and women of prayer. But if the bank account is fat and comfortable, we don't pray. Money and abundance can kill a movement, not fuel it. What fuels a movement is people who are willing to sacrifice their lives, who do it because they love the Lord and they don't care about the money. It is not money that drives them. It is sacrifice and the call of God. And then 7, theological training and seminary education can kill a movement. Listen to me carefully. Because it can develop a strong clergy class, and the ordinary lay people do not qualify. It can rob the laity of ministry. It is possible to so teach. When I started preaching, I used to talk about the Greek and the Hebrew, and I would impress my members. But after doing this for about 2 years, I realized nobody cares. When I preach, they're asking one question. Please, please, help me walk with God. Tell me what the Lord wants of me. Show me the way I should walk. And it transformed my teaching. I was struck by the passage when Jesus says, go ye into all the world. And he says, and disciple the world, training them to obey all that I have commanded you. Do you know that many pastors are not in the work of training? They're in the work of teaching, as though it's a classroom. And what people want to see is a life submitted to Christ. And they want to be taught or trained how to walk with Christ. But those erudite, messages that we preach that are very impressive with big words and etc., that does not disciple people. Now, I'm not saying that theological school is not important. It is. But when you stand in the pulpit, you are like a chef about to feed your people. And you don't feed people by cutting the carrots and telling them, this has 3% vitamin A and 2% vitamin B and etc. You make a meal that they enjoy to eat and that strengthens them and nurtures them and helps them go out and do the work of God. What happens in the kitchen does not come out into the dining hall. And what happens in the study, as you look to God to help you understand, and as you phrase the Greek and understand the terminologies, doesn't come into the pulpit. You teach and train in a way that gives life. The Methodists used to do that even as untutored people. But their going to theological college killed the church, for they became refined, and they now taught to impress. Now, Africa does need theological training. But I have come to believe that because theological training is so expensive, and we will never be able to produce enough trained graduates of theological colleges so that we can keep up with the growth, the numerical growth of Africa, Bible degrees and masters and PhDs are not the answer for this continent. The training can cobble the church and rob it. But the church needs trained theologians. But insisting that every leader must have a theological degree or a master's degree or a PhD can prove to be a poison chalice to kill what God will do on this continent. Africa needs church workers, many, many more leaders. If we must train them through theological college, we will lag far behind the growth of the population. We'll never catch up. I suggest that the best theological school is a school of daily discipleship in the local church under a mentor who knows the scriptures, in a small missional group studying scriptures while doing ministry with their feet firmly planted in the real day-to-day life of ministry and evangelism. A devotional study of practical piety with a group of friends who hold you accountable, who you study together, and not a sterile classroom in a college for 4 years. Our ministers need to know the Bible well, but they do not need to know it only through theological college. We need trained theologians, but somehow we must learn on the job. We must train our leaders as apprentices. What we were told by Pastor Moses, that each of us would have 10 people that we invested who become firmly grounded in Christ, who know the scriptures, and who can go and speak the word of God. This training has to take place in the trenches, in the church. And maybe 1 out of every 20 or 1 out of every 30 can go to theological college, and they keep us aright. They develop the materials. They are the ones who write the books. But the rest of us in the trenches, we learn our theology and we learn the Bible. I believe that there is the possibility of a movement here on this continent. And I'm waiting for it. And I want to be ready. Will you ride that wave? Or are you after the 1% and the 6% and we'll never see a movement? God give us the humility to be ready. God bless you.